The Vatican, of course, has released a variety of documents around AI from a Catholic perspective, whether they are remarks made by the late Pope Francis or the Note Antiqua et Nova. I've mentioned those in the past, but another document was released recently. Al, do you want to talk a little bit about the USCCB's AI policy document, or just reference it?
Yeah, the USCCB on June 9th sent a letter to Congress talking about what are the ethical implications. And I know in the chat here and taking a look at the forum that we are associated with, there's a lot of concern about the ethics. There's ethics behind dropping AI-guided bombs, but there's also ethics around how do we help our students? How do we form our students so that they are presenting their own work? And how do we make sure that they're using tools responsibly? To see Christ in each other and not necessarily to bully and demean others. And so the letter spoke to that pretty well. One of the things that it asked us to do is to think about how we can use AI to supplement what human beings do, not replace them or their moral judgments. And that aligns really well with what the Department of Education had written a couple of years ago about AI. And really the message is, how do we keep people in the middle? How do we keep us as the decision makers in the middle of the process and not abdicate our responsibility for creation or responsibility for what we say to these machines? So how can we use them responsibly in ways that enhance what we do, but not replace us?
Another document that was released, the one that you pulled today's prayer from, was from the Catholic I always get it wrong. It's the Maryland Catholic Conference. Can you speak a little bit more to that, and then maybe specifically what it says about education?
Yeah, thank you. So the Maryland Catholic Conference wrote this just to their membership, but I think it has implications for many of us. So they call out a few things that I think are really poignant. One is to talk about media literacy. And so there's a whole, as the old English language arts teacher in me really is passionate about this. We used to think media literacy is like, how do we know what source things are coming from? Are we reading, reliable books? Are we looking at reliable websites? And this is getting just so much more difficult now with AI. And so we have to do this. And I think through modeling with our students, how do we show our students how do we use this responsibly, but also be careful about the sources that we're using, because this is changing really rapidly. They talk about the cultivation of virtue and empathy and authentic relationships, not replacing the human relationships. And just kind of skip ahead kind of to the end. One thing that they really want us to make sure that we do is prioritize AI in a use that expands educational access among Catholic schools, colleges, and universities. So those are the things that I pointed out, but I wasn't even looking at your slides, Louis. What did I miss that you had written down there?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on most of it already. What I included also in the slides is this kind of message that they send, that despite these concerns, we affirm that AI, when developed and used ethically, can greatly contribute to the mission of the church and the common good. Like the printing press, radio, and the internet, AI is a tool and can be directed towards holiness, healing, and human development.
And
One
I would
thing
add
that
to that, and this is where I come in as kind of like the champion for these things. I feel called to do it. We can either just say that these tools are too much and scary and we're not going to use them right now, but what if we had done that with the other media in the big revolutions that we've had in the past?
What I like to just emphasize in that is Pope Francis spoke about AI as a tool, right? And like any tool, it can be used for good or for harm. Its ethical components depend upon its use, right? So printing press, radio, internet, all of those, it all depends on how it is used. And for some reason or another, we often kind of have this image of the Terminator when we think about AI, but in practicalities, maybe it's more like Wally. Or Father Nate, in giving his keynote, likes to encourage educators and leaders to think of AI less of like this Terminator type scary figure, and more of a potentially helpful AI robot assistant. But I think those are, in terms of this document, those were the two main things that I wanted to call out from it.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And thank you for putting those slides in. It's just such an active topic. Those two documents just came out like this month, pretty much. Yeah, I'm glad that we got to talk about those. It's an active conversation in and out of education.
I could see someone listen along or watching the video later be like, do we even need a policy? Do we even need to go down that route? Or even what needs to be stated in that policy? Is something like, could this just all be lumped into an acceptable use policy or a technology policy? Or do we need something that is specific and granular, that kind of touches on all of the edge use cases of generative AI in education?
Yeah, and I've come a little bit of a ways. So a year or two ago, I used to say, well, we don't even need an AI policy, mostly because our schools have acceptable use policies already, and our schools already have an honor code. And so instead of maybe having an AI specific policy, think about how those policies might already cover a lot of the ground that we want to cover, or maybe need to be modified a little bit just to make reference to AI. Again, thinking about permission giving as well as setting up the guide rails. Um, so I do think that we should have a couple of policies. One is student facing, one is faculty facing, and one maybe at the diocesan level that is more school facing. And just really briefly, I might say that that would be the school facing, the diocesan policy is that schools will have a policy about the use of AI for students and teachers and faculty. And I generally think that the policy for students should say something about how we will only use AI in ways that are instructed by our teacher. And I know that in our pre-conversation here, Louis, you and I kind of had a disagreement about what that was. I'm kind of like a whitelist guy. You're only going to use it in ways that we tell you to use it. And then the faculty side is that you are allowed to use it and model it, but do so in ways that are responsible. So we need to think about tools that are already aimed towards education sector and make sure that they take into account the age of students themselves. And FERPA is not really an issue. We're not typically creating educational or retaining educational records, but COPPA is a policy. So we want to think about what the data is being collected. And then the final thing, and this is the tricky part, is we don't know exactly what the engine's going to be delivering to students. So is there an assurance from the vendor that this stuff is going to be age and grade appropriate?
Alan, we could stop the recording now. I think you just gave the whole presentation in 2 minutes. But I think what would be a better use of our time is let's unpack everything that you said, because you hit on student policy, you hit on employee policy, diocesan policy, ethics, legal. So let's go step by step there. Let's start with that diocesan policy. You mentioned that the diocesan policy, the diocese's policy might just be schools need to make a policy. I was chatting with a superintendent who had a different perspective. They said in the past, our diocese has created the policies for schools to then hand to students. So there's a spectrum there. Do you have any thoughts on where dioceses might want to sit on that spectrum or opinions on either side?
Yeah, I think a lot of dioceses have different approaches to this, right? So our schools tend to be a little bit more independent on creation and application of their own policies within the student handbook that we've created as a diocese. So I think three things. You can say that you just have to have a policy and that policy should be reviewed and approved by the superintendent. You can provide examples of policies, so guiding policies. And Louis, I think you created a great one that's Creative Commons that people can use with attribution. And you could provide a menu, like here are policies that we've looked at that we think is good. Or you can say this is the diocesan policy, put it in your handbook and make sure that every parent signs it. So I think those are the three different approaches. And I don't think that any one is right or wrong. But I think that the reason that we allow schools to do their own policies that we approve is because the schools have their own different charisms. We have schools that really minimize the use of technology in general as part of their charism. And then we have schools that really embrace technology in different ways. And that's responsive to the communities that they serve. So, different families will choose Catholic schools for different reasons. And so that's why we provide more of the menu and open in that regard from the diocesan perspective.
That's super helpful. As we were preparing for this call, you shared the adage that I'm sure many people listening in have heard of, like, you've seen one Catholic school diocese, you've seen one school diocese, right? Each one is so different. Each one has its own unique charism. And thankfully, we can be flexible in how diocesan leaders use policy and roll policy out. You mentioned the HPL resources around policy, and I'll slowly kind of put those links in the chat as we go through today, as we talk about them and bring them up, and then I'll share a participant document at the end that has everything all in one place for you. But I'm going to share my screen and just quickly walk you through one of those documents. This is kind of an institutional stance on AI statement. So you are over here. How can you, whether this is written at the diocesan level or the diocese charges schools to write their own kind of institutional stance, essentially it just states how are you going to connect AI use to the mission of your school and maybe even connecting it further to graduate outcomes. You're going to kind of define your disposition towards AI's promise and risk, maybe drawing on language from the Maryland Catholic Conference document or some other quote from the Vatican. Continually grounding your approach in Catholic teaching and thought, and then kind of clarifying the purpose of that AI policy for your school community. Down here, we have some examples of what this language might look like. You'll notice a familiar name up at the top there, as well as links to church documents and quotes that could be useful for you in kind of defining what your institution's position or stance on AI will be going forward. Moving on from a diocesan policy to, or what the diocese should say, or any organization in signaling how AI could or should not be used within their diocese, let's now shift to how students or what might be included in a student policy, okay? You already mentioned earlier kind of what is that default stance for students? Is it one where students have full access to AI, except when their teachers kind of take that access away, or the opposite? They don't have access to AI tools except when granted by the teacher. Can you speak more to that spectrum?
Yeah, and this is going to be more from a middle school perspective. So I'm aware that there are some AI tools that do point to younger kids. But I'm really more thinking about middle schoolers that might be able to have access to these tools on their own account and going forward. So I tend to think from a policy standpoint that I want students to use AI generally only in ways that their teachers have said is okay in their classroom. And so for middle schoolers, they might have several different teachers that have different stances. And then for the faculty-facing policy, it would be you will let your students know to what degree and in what circumstances AI is acceptable to use. And that can be from generation of ideas to creation of content to just looking and revising. There's many different ways that students can use AI in their classes. And I like menus when it comes to this. I think in our slides here, we have a menu of 5 or 4 categories that you can use it for creating ideas and editing, asking it for help with idea generation. And you could, and then there's disclosure requirements too. Like when I did use it, like what are my responsibilities for sharing that I used it with the audiences that I'm communicating to. So that's the way that I like to say it is done. And there's another way that you can use AI until I tell you not to. But yeah, I think I answered your question.
Similar to you, I come at this from a perspective of a previous middle school teacher as well, and your call out is very valid. Of this is dependent on grade level, it's potentially even dependent on content area. But I was referencing, or I had a conversation with a administrator at a high school where they had a very permissive view on AI. They had something that kind of looked more along the side on the right side, sorry, the left side of the spectrum, right, where students can use AI outside of class to support their understanding and complete assignments, and they take full responsibility for any work completed with AI. Whereas other schools or other grade bands or other classrooms might want to take a more restrictive stance here of I, being coming from a student's perspective, will not use AI outside of class for any purpose unless I receive explicit permission from my teacher. About how do we communicate levels of AI use with students, there are two kind of competing theories on that best way to do so. One is kind of a stoplight model, and another is a menu model. So the stoplight models, they identify three, four, maybe even five different degrees of AI use, ranging from no AI to full AI. They kind of stipulate what happens at each level, and it's meant to be hierarchical, right? So if you say you can do AI assisted editing, that includes being able to do AI assisted idea generation and structuring. Then there was this blog post that came out a year or so ago that shifted the thought away from traffic lights, but to menus, right? So this is our AI cafe menu that kind of shows what are the functions of AI, what are the cognitive functions that AI could replace. And then as a teacher, you could say, okay, students, you can use AI to potentially create content or to analyze, but you cannot use AI for this assessment or in this class for editing or for feedback. So there's two different ways at looking at this.
And I tend to like the menu. It's kind of, I guess, a blend of the two. So like there are like four categories of the kind of work we might typically do in a classroom. You can use AI to a limited extent in this category, but not in that one, right? Like the first draft, you can't use AI at all, maybe. Um, but this is why the school should communicate to teachers that they should communicate to students when AI is appropriately to be used. So, Lewis, in your conversations, like in our honor codes in our schools, some of the rules extend to students' lives outside of the academic setting, right? So, regardless if you're in a community setting or you're in a sports, like we don't condone drug use, we don't condone, violence, and so some of your behavior outside of class and academics could affect your status at school. When you say you can't use AI outside of class, are you talking about in their personal and private lives as well, or did you glean that in your conversations? This is generally towards academic work.
The context of that conversation was generally academic, but I still think that's a fair point, right? To what degree, as private schools, do you uh, have jurisdiction over how students interact with AI? If you say no AI, can they use it to, you know, create some graphic for their birthday party that's next week? And
Yeah.
are you going to come in and police that?
And the reason I raised that is because one of the questions here in the chat was about the ethical uses. And I think we come up with ethical pitfalls pretty often with AI. And so I've already seen examples, not in my own diocese, but I've read of them, of students using voice tools to fake the voice of another student and bully other students in the classroom. And so I think in that way we could, and Lewis, you and I talked about, do we create the menu of things you can't do with AI? Because that list will get longer and longer every year based on how many experiences you've had or read about. Or do we write a more general thing like we will only use these tools to support each other in the image and likeness of God, recognizing Christ in every individual? So that's kind of an open question for me when you're writing this. I tend to try to avoid the menu of stuff. Like these are the the 12 things that we experienced this year, so it's going into the policy book, like these are the don'ts. I'd rather focus on the do's and the ways that we can use these things effectively. But I do think that AI policies can extend to students' lives outside of the school setting for sure. But the ones that we're talking about now are in the classroom and classroom related. So when you said out of class, it just made me think of that. But I'm also thinking about the menus of within the classroom. How can you use it? What are the options?
One idea that I just want to float out before moving to employee AI policy is the potential for a department to set their AI policy. I guess this is more applicable at a high school level, but as opposed to having an individual teacher say, okay, students, this is the default position. How about a department saying, okay, for all science classes, you can use AI in these ways? I'll put a link in the chat to that classroom policy, but I think this could also apply to departments. And then the last kind of policy document that we have to share is around employee use of AI. Al, do you want to kind of take a first stab at that on, what do you see as permissible or impermissible uses of AI for faculty and staff?
Yeah. Even within our diocese, we have different approaches of this. I've had principals come to us aghast that a teacher was using AI for lesson plan development. And others say, well, of course, my teacher should be using this. It makes their job easier and they can be more effective. So let's think about the categories of things that faculty can do. One is for lesson plan creation and generation. The other one is for student work. How do you create the homework assignment? And then the other big one is, do we allow teachers to use AI to evaluate students' work? I have this kind of dystopian view in my head, again, ELA teacher, that teachers might create the lesson and the assignment in AI without really looking at it, give it to the student. The student uses AI just to create the lesson, and then the teacher uses AI to give feedback on the lesson and assign a grade. And maybe that's already logged in with the SIS. And so like within the matter of 12 seconds, the assignment's been created, sent, completed, and put into the grade book. Right? Like that's possible, right? Like this isn't like science fiction anymore. So how do we be permissive, but also be responsible about the use? And I think the things that I saw in the policies that you've shared before, I think apply for students and staff, is that you're responsible for the content. If you're using content, you're responsible for it. So these are not new problems for school leaders. We've had teachers pay teachers before, and we know that there's a variety of quality there. And even if you have a high quality teachers pay teachers like unit plan, the delivery of that unit plan and how that unit plan relates to the children in your school environment really is important. And so we cannot abdicate our role as educators to the AI tools that we use. But the AI tools that we use can really help us differentiate and align our curriculum to standards. So the policy should be sensitive to that. We acknowledge that AI can be helpful in the development of your lesson plans. You're responsible for the content, and we need to make sure that educators are in the middle of that process. You're not being lazy, doing your lesson plans just in AI. You're going to go through iterations, and you're responsible for the final copy of it. And it doesn't change for instructional leaders. Our role is still to be in the classroom, evaluating, watching, and seeing the quality of the interaction of students, teachers, and content. And that dynamic between those three elements, students, teachers, and content, is really where the sweet spot is for educators and for educational leaders. And that's what we can evaluate. Like how they get there, I'm a little agnostic on from my perspective. But if the delivery and the instruction is quality and the learning outcomes are sound, then I'm okay. So it's kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, but I would say you can use it, but you have to be responsible for the stuff you're using.
Correct. A couple things I want to piggyback on. I think that last point of What matters is how you use it, right? It's not the AI in and of itself that has that ethical quality to it. It's how do you use it to further instructional leadership, to further high quality teaching happening in classrooms. What I had kind of shared up on the screen, I'll share it again, are just a list of, are these impermissible uses of AI, right? I think these are great fodder for conversation among faculty. Is it appropriate to use AI to brainstorm lesson ideas or scaffolds for students? Is it appropriate to use AI for grading the final iteration of student work? And under what circumstances, what is the context that makes it permissible or impermissible? And then also, I wanted to touch base on how you mentioned how important it is for employees to take responsibility for what is created with generative AI. In that employee AI policy template that I put in the chat, there's a section, probably one of the first sections under the employee AI responsibilities is review of AI generated content, and essentially stating that employees are responsible for all content generated with generative AI in the same way that they're responsible for sharing any non-generative AI created content. You mentioned teachers pay teachers, right? If you are going to use a teachers pay teachers lesson plan, you can't say, oh no, I didn't know that it wasn't a high quality lesson plan. Same with generative AI. I was guest lecturing one of our master's in education classes last week, and for our ACE teaching fellows, and one of the students said that their school has an AI policy for students that's very restrictive, right? That students, under no circumstances, can use generative AI. They didn't have an AI policy for employees or for faculty and staff, which I think is a common situation that schools are finding themselves in. They've made the policy for the students, but they haven't made the policy for the adults. Um, what are your thoughts on this imbalance between, okay, students can't use AI in any circumstance, but I, as a teacher, can use AI without any guardrails? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there were just a couple things that I pulled out of the keynote at convention and CLS and CEA. What was his name again? The English guy? Do you remember?
Dan
Dan.
Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, Dan Fitzpatrick. And three-quarters of the way through his presentation, he talked about employment. And this just makes me think about that. Like, if you have two equal candidates in front of you, and one says that they can use AI well, and the other one didn't mention AI at all, then you're going to pick the one who can use AI because they're more efficient. They can use these tools of technology. I think that we should allow our teachers to use AI. And I think that we should ask them to be responsible for their content. And this, Kara, gets a little bit to your question. I think that we should ask them to model the effective use of AI for their students. I'm not answering your question. The imbalance between the policies, like we always face our policies at students, but not at staff. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think we're more scared of what we do with students. I think we police our students a lot more than we police our staff. And I think maybe appropriately so. We assume, rightfully so, that our teachers are professionals that come to us with a certain amount of gifts, talents, and skills that they've developed over the years, and that they're still continually developing. So that maybe it's a bit of a respect issue. But I think it's respectful to tell them these are the ways that we can use AI in our school appropriately. It's the guide rails, but it's also permission giving. The absence of a policy is neither, I think. There's going to be the rogue teacher that uses it in these wild ways that eventually you're going to have to deal with when the parents call. But most teachers are just not going to use it because it seems foreign to them. They haven't been told how to.
So the title of this session was Safeguarding What We Hold Dear. And I kind of meant it to be a little ambiguous around what is it that we hold dear? Of course, our students, our faith, our Catholic tradition, our schools, our communities. But I wanted to ask, our critical thinking, social responsibility, the list could go on and on and on. My question to you is, can policy be a tool to safeguard what we hold dear?
Oh, I mean, that's a question just for me. Yes, I think it can. And because when I'm just thinking about what do I hold dear, it's that each and every student in front of me is created in the image and likeness of God. They're beautiful individuals that have beautiful ideas of their own, that were sparked by the Holy Spirit. And using AI in inappropriate and abdicating and lazy ways, it takes that out. It doesn't allow me to see the beauty of my students' minds working in context, right? Like, what are their charisms? How are they sharing their gifts in the world in a real way? I don't care about AI, like when I'm looking at students' work. I care about the kid, like, and where are they now, and how do I get them to the next step? And I think policy can help us do that. So it sets up the guide rails while protecting that which we hold dear, which, for me, we can all define that differently, is the student's personal development, intellectually, spiritually, and in their family. And so I think AI policy can help with that.